It's really a pleasure to be here. I want to start off with just one. I'm sorry, the size. I couldn't quite blow this up, but many of you have probably seen this New Yorker cartoon with the expert on Russia panhandling with the bottle of vodka next to him, which is, I think, a not uncommon popular perception of what's happened to the field of the academic study of what used to be the Soviet Union. This was from the 1990s, but I think the image persists today. I was recently at a meeting with a group of international. It was a meeting at the Council on Foreign Relations, and new members were going around the table describing what they did. So one woman was working on gender discrimination in Afghanistan. Another guy was working on education reform in Africa. Somebody else was working on intellectual property in China. And then I said I was working on Russia and the former Soviet Union. And I could sense this palpable feel of pity in the room, like maybe 20 years ago this seemed like a wise choice, but And I wanted to dispel that notion. That's one of the goals I have for today. My charge is to talk a little bit about how we, meaning academics, have studied what used to be studied the Soviet Union and what's become its successor states. And one point is a very heterogeneous group, I can tell from the background. So if there are points of clarification at any point, please feel free. One of the things that has changed dramatically in political science over the last 20 years is it used to be the case that academics would give a talk that lasted 45 minutes and there'd be 45 minutes for questioning. But we've moved much more towards the economics model of frequent and constant interruptions. So I've become more comfortable with that. So if people have points of clarification, please jump in. In some ways, I'm not in a bad position to talk about this topic. I graduated with a Russian language and literature degree in 1986. I started graduate school in 1989, studied under the much esteemed Professor Motil. And I've been working I got my degree in 1997, and I've been working in the field ever since. I want to talk a little bit about the sources of change. And one of the sources of change is obviously that the unit that we're studying has changed dramatically from one country to 15 countries, one Communist Party-led government to much more heterogeneous set of types of governments. And we're no longer counting the members of the Politburo on the Lenin's tomb, but counting the billionaires who are in the members of the Forbes 100. So that's one source of change. But I think other sources of change that are also important there's been great changes in political science over the last 20 years, and that's had a big impact on how we studied the region. And also just the opening up of new data sources and new colleagues from the region, I think, has had a very salutary effect on how we study the region in a number of ways. So just to cut to some of the main points, the study of Soviet politics, aka Sovietology, or the even more damning Kremlinology, is not so easily caricatured when you look at what actually scholars were doing. The constraints that scholars faced, I think, were really severe and not to be underestimated in looking back at just how difficult it was to conduct research. It's not surprising that the limits on what the field could accomplish were much lower than we might have expected in other regions. Also, the kind of reports of the death of the study of the region in academia are greatly exaggerated. In a lot of ways, this is a very exciting time to be studying the field, although there are some signs of ill health in the future. And finally, there's many new opportunities to study the region, new data sources, new colleagues, still great interest from the region. But the interest from the policy community has receded a lot. And I'm not sure whether to treat that as just an irony that now that we can actually study the region in a more comprehensive way and be more confident about the claims we make about the region, that this is happening at the same time that interest from the policy community is receding. That might be a cause. It might be the very fact that we have all these great opportunities to do research in the region is precisely because the policy stakes are a lot lower. But that's just something to chew on. So what I'll do is I'll talk briefly about how American academics studied the Soviet Union, particularly in the late 1980s. And I think the easiest way to get the point across is to take one example and to look at one question that preoccupied political scientists and economists, particularly in the Brezhnev era, was what were the prospects for political change under Soviet power, and talk about some of the frames that scholars adopted to try to answer this question. Then I'll talk a little bit about the post-Soviet period, where I've done most of my work. And again, to look at a specific question that scholars have studied, the relationship between democracy and markets, and look at some of the ways that people have studied it, what some of the conclusions have been. And then finally, I'll try to sum up by looking at changes in how the field is studied over the last 20 years, and perhaps offer some speculation about new directions that the field might be heading. I'm very privileged to have some very good graduate students, and I'm sometimes it's very interesting to compare how their perception of the field differs from mine, and that will be an important source for my comments. Okay. And again, if there are any questions along the way, please feel free to interrupt. Okay. If we think about the studies of Soviet politics in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, I think the best way to characterize it as this is really normal research in very abnormal circumstances. Right? Some scholars have charged that what actually was going on was this was primarily ideology serving, masquerading as research on the region, given the highly politicized nature of the field. But I do think it's very important to remember the constraints that people were operating under. The inability to do public opinion surveys, the inability to have access to anything more than the public utterances of members, high members of the state and the party bureaucracy. The inability to do focus groups, the lack of high-quality data, and even the data that was introduced was highly biased in lots of ways. And a lot of what there's one nice quote where I'll paraphrase, where one scholar who was working with economic data from the Soviet Union said, basically, by the time you figure out what the data really means, and how much effort you put into understanding just what the data really are, you're so exhausted that you can't then take the next step and try to analyze why the data look the way it does. So I think it's important to keep that in mind. Alfred Meyer from Michigan has another quote that I like, and this might be true as well, not just for Soviet studies, but for social science more generally, where he said it's axiomatic in the field of Soviet studies that one is never right, one is only wrong with varying degrees of vulnerability. Very kind of Popperian view of how we do social science. And despite the criticisms that Sovietology missed the boat by failing to predict the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, I think that charge is a little bit, it holds the bar a little bit too high. One analogy that Thomas Remington likes to make, and I think it's an apt one, is that criticizing political scientists studying the Soviet Union for not predicting the collapse of communism in 1989 is a bit like criticizing seismologists for not predicting earthquakes specifically. Right? His argument is that the main approaches to studying Soviet politics had identified a lot of the kind of recurring patterns that took place within Soviet politics. And despite the great constraints that people were operating under, scholars did a pretty good job in understanding the basic workings of the system. And indeed, one point that I'll make in just a minute is when we look at the three frames of how scholars studied the prospects for political change, one recurring theme in all these lines of work was that the Soviet system was very difficult to change. It had a number of built-in mechanisms that made any kind of sweeping political change very difficult to occur. So if we talk about the kinds of things that we normally study in social science, everyday politics, the study of the Soviet Union didn't do a particularly bad job, but it's in predicting these really extraordinary events that are kind of outside our normal range of theory building that can really account for why we see for the collapse. So the collapse really should be viewed as in the category of one of these really extreme events that scholars actually don't spend much time thinking about, rather than the normal everyday give and take in politics, which we do spend a lot of time thinking about. Okay. Let me talk about one example of the prospects for political change in the late Soviet era. The background for this was that given the declining rates of economic growth, international challenges from the U.S., from Western Europe, the gap between standards of living between East and West, rising expectations from the populace that had become more urbanized and better educated, many people thought that the prospects for kind of within system political change was very much in the cards, and the question was whether the Communist Party of the Soviet Union could design a more inclusive manner of governing that would not be a democratic system by any stretch, but that would be more inclusive, more participatory, that would take better advantage of the new class of technocrats that had come into fruition in the 60s and 70s. And again, this is in the backdrop of the absence of terror. One of the questions that scholars in the Brezhnev era spent a lot of time thinking about was, how could the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union was primarily held together by terror, that is the arbitrary use of violence for political ends, once terror disappears, shouldn't we have expected the regime to change in fundamental ways or even collapse? But we saw with the end of with Khrushchev coming to power, the terror receded to the background. So what were the bases for popular support of the regime if the regime was not held together primarily by terror? And of course, this is not easy to identify. You couldn't do public opinion polls of people in the Soviet Union and ask them, so, on the whole, do you think the Soviet Union is on the right track or the wrong track? Right? This was just not a possibility. And I think also at the time, all scholars, save for Jerry Huff and a few other dissenters, recognized there were deep structural problems that the Soviet Union, as a kind of mature communist system, was facing. But there was disagreement over the extent of the problems. Were these things that the Soviets could just muddle through without making any kind of deeper fundamental changes? When were the problems likely to kick in? The nationalities questions and the differential birth rates between the minority and the majority Russians, the ups and downs of the international oil market, the aging of the Politburo, all of these different deep structural problems within the Soviet political system all were likely to hit at different time periods. So some people argue that as long as these problems came up one at a time, then the Communist Party would be able to manage these systems without too much difficulty. Okay. So just to give you some sense, this is GDP growth rates that are probably that came out fairly recently. So they're probably the best statistical data that we have, and we do see, from basically 60 on, declining rates of economic growth. And if we look at productivity, which might be an even more important indicator for a kind of modern industrial economy, from 1980 to 1990, actually total factor productivity in the Soviet economy was negative. So this is the good picture. The productivity pictures are even worse. Okay. The three frames that I'm going to talk about that scholars used to kind of interpret the prospects for change, in some ways they're problematic in that they were not really clearly specified theories that identified clear if-then statements that one could then go out and gather evidence and test them to see whether or not they were confirmed or disconfirmed. Often they were pitched at such a high level of abstraction that it was very difficult for scholars to agree on what would be what was the evidentiary basis for confirming or disconfirming these kinds of claims. And in a way, this was not unlike much of political science at the time, which was, particularly in comparative politics, I think a mixture of scholars with deep country knowledge who relied as much on intuition as social science theory in order to study their particular subjects. And there was a big debate among Sovietologists, and this might be something that we want to spend a little time about, was how worthwhile was it to try to introduce basic social science methods that had been used in other countries to study the Soviet Union. Was the Soviet Union such a unique political system that importing concepts such as political participation or interest groups or charisma or leadership theory, were these concepts suitable for studying the Soviet Union? Another take on that debate was that the data constraints were just so severe that the best that scholars should hope to accomplish was rich description rather than real predictive theory, which was a more pragmatic approach. And I think indeed, if we look back at some of the what I consider some of the strongest works from that period, and I've reread some of this actually recently. I have in mind, in particular, Thane Gustafson's work on the energy sector in Russia in the 1980s, 1970s, and 1980s, and it's really useful. He clearly has a deep grasp of the subject matter, but he's not trying to make the same kinds of if-then causal claims that we often see in social science currently. On the other hand, I learned a tremendous amount from reading the work. Okay, so let's think of one frame, and this was kind of this what we might call a soft totalitarian frame, right? This is the watered-down version of the capital T totalitarian model developed for the Stalin era, which relied. This version relied heavily on terror, social mobilization from below, and the necessity of periodic purges in order for the system to cleanse itself. One of the things that Professor Model drilled into me as a student, and I think is a very valuable lesson, is the use and abuse of metaphors in social science research. So this notion that the Soviet Union was a system that periodically had to purge itself, as if it would go on these. It had an eating disorder and would go on these binges and then have to purge itself. I'm not sure that that's really it's very evocative, but I'm not sure as an analytical tool it's all that useful. And if we remember Brzezinski's thesis, the notion was that purges were really essential to the system. And to his credit, if we look at communist political systems around the globe, we do see that these kinds of purges are very common in communist types of systems. But his dissertation had the unfortunate feature that it came out just as Stalin was dying and Khrushchev was declaring the purges over, and then the Soviet system continued on into the future. So this kind of soft totalitarian model that scholars adopted, they continued to adopt well into the 70s and 80s, was more like a laundry list of central features of the Soviet system rather than a clear theory with kind of moving parts that would allow one to make if-then causal claims. Rather, it said that ideology was paramount, that coercion played a central role. The party held a monopoly over the media, the military, and the economy. And as long as these six features of the Soviet system were paramount, then the totalitarian model was supported. And to the extent that the system veered from these six features, the totalitarian model was not supported. The argument was that the system was designed to weed out new ideas and potential opposition, and that not political development or political reform or political liberalization was likely, but only political decay is the likely outcome. Again, this is this metaphor of decay and growth. Again, they're not really helpful in trying to measure specifically changes in the political system, although they are very evocative. And examples of kinds of things that scholars in this line of research study was really elite politics, patterns of recruitment. The notion was, why bother studying society? Society is irrelevant. The party holds all the cards. And even to admit that there was something such as society as an independent causal force in politics was already to refute the model. So why bother studying it? One of the strengths, I think, of this approach, though, was its emphasis on the fusion of economic and political power, which really, I think, was very characteristic of the Soviet, characteristic of all political systems. We all know that the rich, the landlord got his rights before the milkmaid, right? In the English case, and the rich always have more political influence than the poor. Okay, but I think in the Soviet case, it was really an extreme version of this. And even when rulers recognized that economic reforms were necessary, they also recognized that to push economic reforms to the extent to which that they would actually have an impact in making the economy work better would also require giving up political power to the extent that they were uncomfortable. So we tended to get this treadmill of reforms where the economy would deteriorate. Rulers would introduce reforms in order to counteract the decline in economic performance. However, those economic reforms would then be seen as politically destabilizing by the rulers as they delegated more economic decision-making power either to managers or to bureaucrats within the ministry or local-level bureaucrats within the party. And eventually, as the political threat increased, the central authorities would then take the reins back and re-centralize economic and political decision-making. So we tended to get this treadmill of reforms. And again, this is a metaphor, but I like this metaphor, and I think actually this is an analytically useful one. The totalitarian model was very tenacious. This is a quote from General Odom in 1992 in World Politics, which is probably the premier journal in comparative politics. The totalitarian model has far more analytic utility than its competitors because the totalitarian model captures critical features of the system that tend to get pushed aside by other models. This seems to be a very low bar in measuring whether or not a theory is particularly useful, because it shines its light in the right place. Well, what we really would like is a theory that's built on kind of first principles about how people behave, and then some clear statements that lead you to look for evidence that allows you to try to figure out whether your argument is right or not. This school tended to see the collapse of reform in the Soviet Union as vindication. This was evidence, of course, that once the party pushed reforms far enough, everything could fall apart because the system in it was inherently incapable of reform. But in general, just because one gets the prediction right is no evidence that the logic of the argument is supported, right? People can make all kinds of predictions that might be right, but in order to make a prediction very persuasive or an argument very persuasive, we have to look at the underlying logic of the argument to see whether or not the outcome occurred in the way that the argument would have predicted that it would have, or in the way that the argument can actually account for, give a good reason why we should have expected this outcome. And on all those measures, I think the totalitarian model falls pretty flat. That there were no real means by which reform could take place under the totalitarian model. If the party maintained its monopoly over the military, the media, the economy, and the political system, how was it that Gorbachev could have come about in the first place, right? What was the mechanism that could have made it possible for Perestroika and Glasnost to get even off the ground, right? So I'm not the first to make this criticism of this totalitarian model, but I think that this really is evidence that that this frame, if you will, was really not an especially helpful one in accounting for the prospects for political or economic reform, despite its emphasis on how difficult it was to reform the political system. Okay, a second frame that scholars used was a more modernizing frame, that the power of economic development and economic growth would lead to social change, the creation of new interest groups, that would then put pressure on political elites to adopt policies that were less ideological, that were more oriented towards consumers, that catered more to what some scholars called a new middle class within within the Soviet Union. The notion here was that by the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, most Soviet citizens lived in cities. Literacy rates were very high. Many of the urbanites were aware of differences in standards of living across between the East and the West, and that there had arisen that a new kind of Soviet social contract had arisen, where as long as the party was able to deliver increasing standards of living, the populace was willing to accept curtailments of their political and economic rights, right? So this is obviously a very different frame with lots of different implications than the watered-down totalitarian model, and one can overlay the policy implications and the political divides that these two approaches suggest. So what are the kinds of things that scholars in this modernizing vein looked at? Well, one of the things that they studied was the role of technocrats in policymaking, whether it was studying Institutchiki in the Institute of USA Canada and their influence on foreign policy, or technocrats in the economic ministries, or in the Ministry of Oil and Gas in the Gustafson case. And the notion here was that if previously ideology had played a much larger role in policy making, technocrats with some policy expertise were having an expanding role in policy making, and this was possibly making the system somewhat more rational and somewhat less purely political than it had been in previous periods. Scholars also looked at the changing balance of spending on consumer goods versus heavy industry, and that there was this rise of the Soviet social contract that of guaranteed employment, rising standards of living, and as long as those goods were delivered and people did not openly dissent from the political system, then the power of the state would not come to be yielded upon citizens. And there was this tacit agreement of what the rules of the political and economic game were between the state and society. Other scholars, such as Donna Berry, looked at changes, and Brian Silver looked at changes in the values of social groups, in part using this Soviet interview project, and also looking at the writings of different generations of academics. So the notion here was that as the economy became more complex, And as society became more differentiated and more urban, that there would be changes in values of social groups, there would be changes in the balance of power between ideologues and technocrats in the policy-making process, and that this would produce some kind of within-system change that would make the Soviet system more rational, less ideological, and better able to meet the challenges of modernization. A kind of sub-heading of this modernization literature was on nationalities questions, and I'm sure Alex Moda will talk more about this. He knows a lot more about this than I do. But one of the questions here was, would economic development dampen or strengthen national identities? The kind of classic modernization view would be that as societies develop and different ethnic groups come in contact with other kinds of ethnic groups, local identities become less salient, and national identities become, so kind of local ethnic identities become less salient. However, other people argue that no, economic development can often mean changes in the labor market that often divide along ethnic lines, and that this can be a recipe for strengthening of national identities and potentially even ethnic conflict. The Soviet case, in some ways, with its ethnic quota system for employment, was almost a recipe for reifying these types of national identities. So there was even some specific features of the Soviet system that might have lent itself to the notion that economic development would heighten national identities. Okay. This used to give some idea of some of the changes in society. For example, a percentage of the population owning a refrigerator, a television, washing machine, and cars. And on the one hand, one can say, well, look, of course, these kinds of massive social changes that were taking place, they're inevitably going to be reflected in the political system. That was kind of the very sociological approach to how political change comes about. However, other people could say, well, great, yeah, people are more have more consumer goods, but look, the party is still in control. They're the ones that are making the political decisions. So it's not necessarily the case that social change gets necessarily reflected into politics. Okay, sure. Yeah.
Are you talking about communal apartments?
Actually, it's a good question. I'm not. Let me see where I got. I can tell you where I got the data from, and if anybody wants to go look it up on Google, they would be fine. Actually, let me see where I can go back. You see, this is also the question. Whenever you put up data, you always get lots of questions. So, yeah. So refrigerator, television, washing machine. Yeah, maybe it's access to one in a communal apartment even. The cars data looks right. The refrigerator data, I think, probably looks. The television data, I think, certainly looks okay. The washing machine and the refrigerators. In any case, the general point is that from 1965 to 1980, there was an unprecedented boom in consumer goods in the Soviet period, and many people thought that this was evidence of this change in the relationship between state and society, and that the Soviet Union was becoming a more normal place without terror, in which the state had to deliver some kind of social benefits to citizens in order to stay in power in a normal kind of way that states and societies exchanged rights for security for forever. Okay. However, this view would have predicted gradual evolutionary change in the political system, and that this pressure from below would have really been driven by societal forces or younger or lower level political elites. But this isn't really what we saw happening in the Gorbachev period, where the change was initiated primarily from above, and it was Gorbachev's attempts to reach out into society to find groups that were willing to support his changes that was really what many people argue would be the most important dynamic, rather than society kind of pushing the party to adopt changes that were more closer to its preferences. So at least this kind of modernization view had identified one possible source of change, but also was not especially satisfactory. A third frame was this leadership frame. And that the notion was that the Soviet system, given its great centralization of decision-making power, really privileged leaders. And once one became the general secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, they could change the rules of the game, much more so than in other types of political systems, to suit their own power bases and policy preferences. So I'm sure for those people who've took Soviet politics back in the day, the standard way to study Soviet politics was the Leninist period, the Stalinist period, the Thaw, and then the Brezhnev period. There's a lot of assumptions built into that way of thinking about how we study the Soviet Union, that leaders matter, for example. That's just baked in the cake. It's not even something that's questioned. And that may or may not be true. You know, we look at lots of polities that were fairly consistent across across leaders, lots of problems that leaders took very similar approaches to resolving. The scholars in this vein tended to study generational cohorts and how they replaced each other, and did different generations have different values and different kinds of policy preferences. They also studied how elites built coalitions and gained authority, especially in the absence of terror. Right? So Breslauer's work on how Brezhnev and Khrushchev built their political machines, I think, was really one of the really most interesting works in this vein. So one of the things that they put a lot of emphasis on was this aging of the average age of Politburo members, which is really quite shocking. So here the notion is that as the average age, it's not just that the general secretaries were getting older, but even at all levels of the political system, the average age was going up. I'm going to go back to the previous one. Right. So then here the notion is to account for political reform and the prospects for political change. You need leadership succession and perhaps generational change. But otherwise, we should see very much policy stasis between leadership changes. So we have these kind of punctuated equilibrium moments where the leader, there's a leadership struggle, lots of different policies are debated. However, once a general secretary consolidates their power, then a new policy line is established, and that line reigns until the next guy comes along, dies off, another policy struggle, and the general line gets... and I think there's something to this pattern, and at least it gives you some ability to make predictions about when we should see new policies introduced and when not. However, leadership change is necessary but not sufficient for accounting for the prospects for political change. Also, there was a lot of attempts to read leaders' intentions. There was a lot of Gorbachev must have been thinking X. I don't know if anybody remembers the old Spy magazine from the early 1990s, which was a great humor magazine. And I remember they had this one section about quotes from 10 different scholars saying Gorbachev must have been thinking blah blah blah. And the notion was just, how do you know what Gorbachev was thinking? Did he, even if you sat down with him, would he actually tell you, what his strategy was? Seeing that, he told. Big part of his strategy was making sure that people didn't know what he was going to do. Also, it leaves a lot of the most interesting questions unasked. Why this leader and not another? Right? It doesn't really give us any leverage for why change should go in a liberalizing direction rather than a much more conservative directions. And in less skilled hands, it really bordered on kind of ad hoc, descriptive accounts of political change in the sense that it had to happen that way because it did happen that way. Right. Okay, so in general, these were these three frames that scholars used, and in general, they were pretty good at identifying a lot of the ways in which the Soviet system was resistant to change, and I think that was some of the people were pretty good about looking at the institutional constraints that made it difficult for really deep political change to take place and for the Soviet system to answer the challenges that it faced in the 1970s and 80s. However, there are a lot of weaknesses as well. in general, there was this misguided search for a silver bullet, that there would be one theory that would allow us to unlock the key to the Soviet system and answer all questions across all places and time. The theories very rarely had any kind of scope conditions that said, for this period of time that I'm studying, for this policy area, we would expect to see X, Y, and Z. In general, there was a great deal of concept structuring where arguments made about one sector would be applied to a completely different realm of Soviet politics as if that was fair game. There's also just this, the evidentiary basis for arguments was also weak, and not only in the sense that there wasn't a lot of good, high-quality data out there that would allow you to discriminate between arguments. The arguments themselves, the theories that people were putting forward, these three frames that I've just described, they don't give you any clear benchmarks for how to judge the theory. So how much factionalism was necessary in order to say that the totalitarian model was discredited? Right? How much social change was necessary before we should expect some change in policy by the party? How much generational turnover does there need to be in order for the political system to change itself? So there wasn't, even when there was evidence in order to adjudicate between the claims, the theories weren't specific enough to allow us to say, yes, this evidence supports and this evidence doesn't support. Okay, so that was the kind of main line of work that scholars were doing in the 70s and 80s. But there was also another type of work, which was a kind of a retreat into really the specific specificities of the Soviet case. This is what the workers in Omsk model, which was, there's some scholars who just decide, look, the grand theories, I think, are too abstract, very valid criticism. The data constraints are so severe, valid criticism. I'm just going to be the expert on one specific topic and go very deep. And there's something to that, but then that also didn't kind of lend itself well to broader generalizations about the political system. Also, the field was highly politicized. I think David Engerman spoke earlier here, right? And I'm sure that he could speak to this better than I can. But I think even in David's work, I think he could have there was a lot more blood on the floor, I think, than even David in his book that I think is a great book, even as he lets on. I think there were lots of examples where policy prescriptions really seemed to guide the analysis rather than vice versa. And in a way, it's understandable the policy stakes were clearly very high. So even well-intentioned scholars wanted to, conclude their article with the obligatory, thus for policy we should do A, B, and C. Not unreasonable, not an unreasonable thing to do. There was also the attraction of punditry, the demand to be, the demand from not just policymakers but media for commentary on the field. I think also tended to politicize the field, as even back before Fox News, the notions that tend to make it on the in the news programs tend to be very polarizing views. And again, this politicization, I think, was also was also exacerbated by the lack of data. Since scholars couldn't argue about the quality of data, it was much easier to politicize the debate, question scholars' intentions, and argue on those bases rather than on a clear evidentiary basis. In some ways, the field was a little bit akin to how China is studied today, where you have this fantastically interesting case where scholars are doing an awful lot of work but are facing real constraints on the kinds of analyses that they can conduct. And their ability to generalize their arguments from the China case to other types of political systems is very limited, just given the nature of the subject matter. And in the most unskilled hands, the reporting from Moscow was, or the reports on, who was up and who was down in the Kremlin were based on the mood in Moscow, which was one unfortunate phrase that people use, which really meant my friends in Moscow who I was talking to would say, think this is going to happen. And there are other sources of data that might be more reliable. But I do think that it's important to recognize that just the lack of good data lends itself to the politicization of these kinds of debates. And again, the field also in the 1980s was really in the periphery of the social sciences, particularly in economics. The study of planned economies was a relative backwater in the field. Within political science, it had its own niche. And maybe this wasn't such a bad thing, because social science in the 1980s was not a particularly it was not a particularly exciting time to be doing social science in the 1980s. The kind of excitement of the behavioral revolution of the 1960s, the ideological clashes of the 70s in comparative politics, I think had drained the field had made the field a lot, people were much less willing to take risks. There's lots of disagreements in the field about what we should be doing. Should we be trying to build general theories using cross-national data, or should we be only trying to make claims that were specific to specific countries at specific times? So maybe it's not such a bad thing. However, it's pretty clear that Soviet studies, or the study of the Soviet political system, was really much more of a concept importer than an exporter. So we had lots of studies, Gordon Skilling and the like, on interest groups, where we take a notion that had some currency in the study of countries outside of the Soviet Union, and then apply it to the Soviet case and see how much leverage that gave you. So we had lots of studies of interest groups. We had a number of studies of corporatism, right? That the Soviet system was becoming more corporatist in the sense that organized groups of labor and industry would get together, decide on what the wage bargain would be, and what outputs would be, and that this was, if we want to understand the Soviet system, we should be reading about corporatism, right? In Spain or in Italy. Participation was another particularly contentious concept that was imported. Where scholars were looking at various types of ways that Soviet citizens participated in politics through the druzhiniki, the volunteer brigades, voting, writing letters to Pravda, going to meetings, going to demonstrations, contacting their local party people, local party, kind of lowest level cells within the party for different kinds of benefits, and the notion here was that we should look at participation in the Soviet system as the question was, does participation in the Soviet system then generate some kind of support for the system? Does the participation in the Soviet system reflect acceptance of some of the basic tenets of the Soviet system? And the most extreme version of this was Jerry Huff, where he has this quote where he says, basically, participation in the Soviet system under Brezhnev and participation in the U.S. and modern advanced democracies is a difference really only really, what is it, in kind rather than in I'm losing the phrase here. This was only a small marginal difference rather than a difference of order of magnitude. And he caught a lot of heat for that. But there were other concepts that were more successfully, I think, imported, such as this notion of cooptation, about how autocratic regimes can co-opt certain portions of the elite in order to buy them off, in order to gain their support. But it's pretty clear that Soviet studies was importing concepts from other parts of the social sciences rather than generating them themselves. Oh, okay, very good. The one area where I think where the study of Soviet economics and politics did make an important contribution to social science more generally is this notion of the soft budget constraint that Janos Kornai came up with. This was, I think, really the notion that firms under the Soviet system are not disciplined by competition and therefore have a hard budget constraint, whereas if they don't raise enough a profit, they go out of business. Here, the notion was that due to commitments of full employment, the firms in a command economy faced a soft budget constraint, and from this flowed lots of different implications about how firms would then behave. They would hoard goods, they would hide their labor, they would concentrate on building simple things rather than more complex things. And this notion, I think, had legs in studies of state sectors in even more advanced economies. Okay, I'm going to take just let me sum up here. So I think the point in looking at the academic study of the Soviet Union was that much of the stuff that was studied was the stuff of normal politics, elite recruitment patterns, value change within society, generational turnover. So it's not really so much that the stuff that people were studying was not correct, but there were just tremendous constraints on research, and the specificities of the subjects made it really difficult to build the kind of theory and rigorous and well-supported arguments that would then carry the day and attract attention from people outside the region as well. Okay, let me just stop here if we want to take a brief, I'm told, a plumbing break, which is a felicitous phrase, if I ever, just 5-10 minutes, is that? Yeah, about 10 minutes if people want to take a break. And when we come back, I'll talk about the kind of sources of change and some examples of how the field, how we studied the field has changed. So. Okay, let's kick back up. I'll go for another 15, 20 minutes, then we'll have discussion. Is that about right? Okay. I want to talk very briefly about some of the sources of change in how we've studied the region. One is from theories of one is just the underlying subject matter has changed so much that there was great emphasis on things that were relatively unimportant in the Soviet period becoming much more important afterwards. Study of constitution making, democratic institutions, political party development, federalism, development of market institutions, natural resource politics. All these topics, were kind of thrust on the agenda in a way that they had not been before, and it, obviously put a lot of demand on scholars to develop new skills, to learn new literatures, to learn new subject matters. And so just, the obvious point is just the subject matter had changed a lot. Let's see here. There we are. But there are also, I think, important changes in social science from the kind of 70s and 80s into the 1990s, with a much greater use on quantitative measures, increased use of statistics. I remember when I was a graduate student at Columbia, you could opt out of your statistics courses in favor of language course. And this was very common. And now that's no longer the case. Actually, in our bylaws, it's written that language is not a substitute for statistics, and the students take at least a full year, often a full 2 years of statistics. I didn't take any statistics as a political science graduate student. It's still very important to know the region, I think, but the demands to speaking to a broader audience outside of the region. In general, searches in comparative politics now are much less defined by region. Whereas when I was looking for a position, 15 years ago, it was often we're looking for a person who works on, post-Soviet politics. Now the ads will often just be comparative politics. So there's been a move from what people refer to as drafting towards position, to adopt a sports metaphor, versus going for the best athlete. So I'm not quite certain how I feel about this, because my father was a very good athlete, and he once told me, "Tim, you may be small, but you're slow," which I think is about right. So there's been this move really to de-emphasize region in the choice of scholars, and not to put so much emphasis on covering all regions of the world. But I think the field still recognizes that it's very important to know a region in order to make the kinds of convincing arguments that you need to make. Okay. Okay. Whoops, now we're going the other way. Okay. Also, just the amount of data and the types of colleagues that people work with in the field now. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development has been, in the World Bank and the IMF and all these international organizations have done a service to the field in terms of providing data. We can talk about whether or not they've done a service to the field and lots of other things that they do. That's a separate question, but in terms of providing data, that's been a very helpful thing. Also, what some people call the parachutisti, the scholars who are experts on other regions or other topics, who then became interested in the region, I think injected a real liveliness to the study of the region that the field benefited from having people with very different perspectives jump into the field and write about it. And some of them learned quite a bit about the region. Not all, but some did. Also, the rise of local scholars trained abroad and the training of sociologists to conduct public opinion polls abroad. Pollsters who had gone to the U.S. and then come back and were able to do good kind of, basic normal kind of social science kinds of things, I think was all a very, another source of change that is often underappreciated. I remember in the early 1990s, there were these debates about, given the rapid nature of political and economic change, what should our goals be? Should we be journalists and just try to document the changes, given that the tools that we were working with just were not sufficiently precise to say anything of great importance about those changes? And I think that there was a real trade-off between scholars choosing to say something trivial about something that was substantively important, or something that was academically relevant on a topic that was substantively trivial. So if you wanted to study, say, the presidency in Russia, which was obviously a substantively really important institution, your ability to say anything deep or penetrating about it, given the currency, the newness of the institution, your odds of saying something that would have lasting impact about it were probably pretty low. Whereas if you studied something that was out of the public view, that was much smaller scale, you might have had a better chance to say something that would have relevance into the future. So this trade-off was really very strong. And scholars spent a lot of time debating about what are the proper models and what are the kinds of literatures and comparisons we should be making. Should we be comparing the transition countries to Latin America? Should be comparing them to China? Should we be comparing them to previous periods in Russian or East European history? So there was really a lot of debate about kind of what we should be studying and how we should be studying it. So let me just give one example, which I think is an important question broadly in social science and for the region as well. And this is about the relationship between democracy and markets. Jeffrey Sachs and others argued that building democracy and markets would be reinforcing, as market reforms would weaken the bureaucrats that were opposed to economic reform and democracy. But others were more skeptical. Here's a quote from Klaus Offe, that if you want to have a market economy, it needs to be put in motion only under pre-democratic conditions. Adam Zavorsky, economic reforms can advance quite far under democratic conditions, but they are politically destabilizing. They breed voodoo politics. This was, of course, at the time of the George Bush saying, that Reaganomics was voodoo economics. So that Ken Jowett from Berkeley. In order for economic reform to be successful, it's going to have to be authoritarian. So a good case would be, Czechoslovakia, and it will take the type of liberal authoritarianism that existed in the 19th century Europe for reforms to succeed. And then my colleague Jan Elster has this very cheeky title of the necessity and impossibility of simultaneous political and economic reform. Right? And other scholars looked at the kind of preconditions for building democracy and markets and thought that that these two things would be very difficult for them to go together given these different, the absence of the kinds of preconditions that people thought were important. So if we just look at a little bit of data, this is measures from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. It's a measure of economic reform across 8 different dimensions. The countries kind of break out in a way that you would think that they would, where, Belarus has a very low score, Turkmenistan has a very low score, Poland has a very high score, Moldova is somewhere in the middle, as always. Russia is somewhere in the middle as well. And this just to look at how this score plays out over time. So, and I think this gives some face validity that we have Poland doing, lots of reforms early and very well. Russia doing some reforms, backtracking in 1998, going forward. Belarus just much lower throughout the whole period. So, and this is just kind of correlation between democracy and economic reform from 1990 to 2004, with the Freedom House scores on the y-axis and the level of economic reform on the x-axis. So there seems to be a kind of robust correlation between level of democracy and economic reform, which, let me skip over that, I think is interesting because I think we often have suffer from hindsight bias, that if we look back, a lot of people thought it would be very unexpected that democracy and markets would go hand in hand in the region. But if we look at the evidence, that seems to be the case, that the more democratic countries have more liberal economies, and the more liberal economies tend to have higher levels of democracy. This is not something that was self-evident back in the day. There's some evidence that this is more than correlation. Scholars have done lots of studies controlling for other factors, but the result still holds that there is this, seems to be this relationship between democracy and economic reform. But there's a lot of debate about how this works, right? So does democracy impact economic reforms primarily through elections and electoral competition? Does it have its influence through the presence of more information? Democratic countries tend to have much higher levels of information floating around, and this might be a good thing for policy making. Is it the case that democracy chooses better leaders, that the quality of leaders in democracies through the electoral process is such that better leaders are chosen? Is it the case that democracy puts more constraints on leaders from using their political power to extract resources from groups, and that this is a good thing for market reforms? So there's a lot of debate in the field right now about what is the precise mechanism by which this relationship seems to be working. In some of my own work, I've looked at the impact of democracy on economic reform and argue that when political polarization is low, we get democracy works well, but when political polarization is high, democracy doesn't have a positive impact on economic reform. So trying to refine this argument in a way that makes some sense. So there's still lots of debate, but it's really less at the kind of macro level than more at the level of what's the mechanism. And there's lots of problems, right? Are we measuring economic reform correctly? The EBRD has these 8 indicators that I put up, but who's to say that those are the right 8 things to be looking at? How do we measure democracy? Obviously a contentious subject. Could it be the case that it's not so much democracy promoting economic reform as economic reform promoting democracy? And how do we untangle the direction of causation between these two things that seem closely intertwined? There's also the problem that maybe just democracy and markets in the region go together, and they're driven by a deeper causal factor. Maybe it's something about the way communism was operating in these countries that pushed markets and democracy together in some countries, and non-market and non-democracy outcomes together in another set of countries. So this correlation that we're observing is really just spurious. It's really driven by a deeper causal factor. Maybe it was a level of civil society under communism or some other factors. But I think this isn't a lecture about. This is more a lecture about how we do social science than about social science in particular. So the point here, I think, is that these are kind of more normal social science problems that scholars all around the world deal with all the time. We always fight about measurement and causation and endogeneity and these other kinds of things, rather than questioning somebody's political loyalties because they view the Soviet system one way rather than another. To take an extreme position. Okay. Let me just wrap up with some conclusions, just to document some of the changes in how we study the region. One thing is there is this declining demand for punditry. Whether this is good or bad, we can debate. On the one hand, it means that the field is much more out of the public eye. On the other hand, maybe that's conducive to doing good academic research, and that people are less distracted by trying to get on the television. I remember when somebody asked my mother, "What's Tim going to do with all this education he's gotten?" And my mother had this was in the mid-1990s, she had something that was very perceptive. She said, "I'm not sure, but I think he'll be on McNeil Lehrer at some point." I thought in some ways is actually a very nuanced interpretation on the field. Okay. Another way that I think the kinds of debates that take place in the study of the region, I think, are much more conducive to generalizations to other parts of social science. And one of the things we see is scholars with knowledge of the region co-authoring with scholars with expertise in other parts of the field. I wrote a couple papers, for example, with Ed Mansfield, who is an expert on international trade, and we looked at patterns of trade liberalization in the post-communist world. Dan Treisman and Hongbin Kai have written a number of models comparing the Chinese federalism and Russian federalism. Timothy Colton and Stephen Holmes have a very nice volume on state institutions in Russia, Holmes being more of a political theorist, and Colton being obviously a well-known expert on Russia. So that these kinds of collaborations, I think, are very common and very fruitful. Also, I think there's greater representation in the top field journals and among prize winners from people in our region. So contra the view that the experts on Russia and the region are panhandling on the sidewalk, if you look at a lot of the general journals in political science, post-communist politics is very well represented. And in some ways, we're privileged in that the local populations local scholars that we have to work with are typically better trained than they are in lots of other parts of the world. Until recently, the costs of doing research in the region were such that for not a lot of money, one could collect a lot of data, and that's unfortunately with the ruble strengthening, that's changed quite a bit. But still, in the regions and in other countries, the dollar still goes a relatively long way in terms of doing field research. So in a lot of ways, and also most importantly, the topics that are of interest to the fields are central issues in political science more generally: ethnic conflict, democratization, economic reform, reform of the welfare state, social mobilization. All the big issues in the field, I think, are front and center in our region. Again, I've talked a little bit about this. The availability of data has really changed the field. Just a couple examples. Martin Dimitrov has been working in the KGB files in Bulgaria, writing about their role in the 1980s and then in the 1990s, something that I think hard to imagine prior to 1989. Also, there's a new historical approach. There's a number of very interesting papers looking at the kind of long-distance historical drivers of contemporary outcomes. There's a nice paper by Katya Zhuravskaya and her co-authors. She's a Russian woman who has a PhD in economics from Harvard, and what she and her co-authors demonstrate that in areas of the Pale in the former Soviet and East European space, even to this day, there are lower levels of political trust. There's less support for democracy. And the argument there is that the great social dislocations that were caused in the 1930s and 1940s have had long-lasting social impacts, and they're able to demonstrate that. It's very, very interesting work. There's also a nice paper by Irina Grosjean, where she looks at the development of financial institutions in Ottoman and non-Ottoman areas in the region, and finds that even to this day, the level of financial development is less pronounced in regions where the Ottoman rule was most pronounced. My colleague Scott Yelbach is looking at peasant revolts in the 19th century to look at how an autocratic regime dealt with social mobilization from below, which is a very current topic, given events in the Middle East and other parts of the world. Also, local voices. Lots of us co-author very frequently with scholars from the region. I think this has had a very good impact on keeping foreign scholars on their toes, because the questions that my foreign scholars that I'm working with, they tend to be different types of questions than the questions that I usually get from scholars who are not from the region. I think that's a very good thing. They're also very adept at finding new sources of data. So although across the region, the quality of the training and the familiarity with kind of international social science it varies quite a bit. In lots of cases, the introduction of local voices into the study of the region, I think, is a really very, very welcome thing. Also, there's this is an exciting time, and there's very new opportunities. I wasn't sure whether to talk about this, but maybe it makes some sense to do so. I recently, along with a Russian colleague that I've known for 20 years, received a large grant from the Russian government to create a center for the study of institutions and development at the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. So we got a big pile of money to bring together 6 Americans and about 10 Russian scholars. And over the next 3 years, we've promised to publish 6 articles, or have accepted, not have published, have accepted 6 articles over the next 3 years on the different projects that we're working on. And the main deliverable on our side is not policy advice, but it's articles in international peer-reviewed social science journals. It's kind of unfathomable, even 5 or 10 years ago. And in this way, the oil money that we're all paying in higher gas prices is being funneled back, hopefully, in a way that is useful. And as a matter of fact, one of the projects that we're working on, we're actually working with the Research Academy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs to study police reform, which again is, this whole thing might fall apart tomorrow. There's lots of reasons why it might fail. But just that this is a topic that we're considering. There's a lot of interest on both sides, that we've already, have a research design and already, planning to do this kind of work, I think speaks to a real, sea change in how the field is funded, what the goals are. And the goal for the Russian government here, I think, is to try to make the Higher School of Economics a much more international place, to raise its profile, and to really build it up as a center for international education. And again, one of the ironies here is it's at this time when we have all these great opportunities, to fly off to Bishkek and hold Alex should talk about the conference he just came back from with this group of scholars from all over the former Soviet space and the U.S. At the same time, we have these tremendous opportunities. Interest in the field, particularly in the policy community, has receded quite a bit. Okay, let me just sum up. I'll leave this up on the board. I think that this is really still a very exciting time to be in the field, in part because we can do the kinds of normal social science research that is valued in the field and is that I find exciting, at least. Maybe others not so much. The field still has a lot of problems. The budget cuts in language funding, I think, are really going to have a very damaging effect on studying in the region. There's also, in a lot of countries, increasing political pressure on the kinds of topics that you can do research on, given the increasingly autocratic bent of a number of countries in the region. The new generation of students on the region, I'm shocked at how well some of them are trained in terms of language, and the kinds of training that they're getting, I think, I just envy them. But there are fewer of them. I think this year in comparative politics to Columbia, we had 200 applications just in comparative politics, and I could count on one hand the number of, qualified, students that made it into the kind of first or second big cuts that were interested in working on the region. We were lucky to get 2 students this year who were working on the region. The year before that we had 0. The year before that we had 2. The year before that we had 0. The year before that we had 1. So, and we're doing relatively well. So there are many fewer students working on the region, but they are better trained, and they also have a lot less of the baggage of I'm amazed at how adept they are at running around across the region, and their ability to pick up new languages, and they're just really, compared to how I was coming in, I think that they're in much better shape, but there's just many fewer of them. And then again, this point that I made before, that just as we're less relevant to policy, we can start to do better social science, and I don't know whether we should laugh at that or praise it. So that's just the main points I wanted to emphasize. So I'm glad to take questions before we have a broader discussion this afternoon. So thanks for all your attention. Yeah.